Subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll always find moving stories full of faith, true love, resilience, and twists and turns that seem straight out of real life. And tell me in the comments, where in the United States or around the world are you watching this story from? Your comment and like will help this channel grow and continue delivering content like this. The morning dawned golden on the Carter Ranch in Willow Creek, Texas. The clear sky, the smell of freshly cut hay, and the distant sound of chapel bells set the scene for the most anticipated day of Emily Carter's life. Dressed in a delicate white gown hand-sewn by her own mother, she stared at herself in the mirror with her heart racing. The former horse groom's daughter was about to marry James Whitmore, the heir to one of the region's wealthiest families. An unlikely but blessed romance, or so everyone said. Outside, guests took their places on the wooden pews of the small chapel at the top of the hill. The pastor adjusted his tie, the musicians discreetly practiced the first chords, and everyone waited with smiles on their faces. But something was wrong. James's best man was knocking on the bedroom door of the main house at Whitmore Farm, calling out without answer. The radio in the room was still playing a country station, but there was no sign of the groom. When the door was finally broken down, the room was empty. On the dresser rested the rings and a hastily written note. "Forgive me, I couldn't do it." When the news reached the chapel, Emily was still clutching the bouquet. Her father, Charles Carter, approached with guilt-ridden eyes and whispered something in her ear. Time froze. She didn't scream, didn't faint. She simply turned her face toward the altar, slowly descended the chapel steps, and disappeared among the oak trees along the dirt path. The entire town was shocked, and at that very moment, unbeknownst to her, Emily began the most profound, painful, and miraculous story the land had ever known. 3 days later, she returned, thinner, with a distant look in her eyes, but with her head held high. She rejected all advice to leave Willow Creek, ignored the gossip, and sought no explanations or justice. She returned to the small wooden house at the end of the road where she had grown up and started her life from scratch. She tended the crops, washed clothes for others, and baked pies to sell at the local grocery store. And every night, alone on the porch, with the radio tuned to an AM station, she prayed silently, never for revenge, always for strength. Too. Months later, the nausea began. Emily thought it was stress, but confirmation soon came. She was pregnant. Pregnant by the man who had abandoned her at the altar. The news shook her to her core. She cried alone for 3 days. Then, on the 4th day, on her knees in the barn, she whispered to God, "If this child is a reminder of pain, then let it also be a reason for hope." And she resolved that this baby would not grow up with hatred, nor would he hear lies. He would grow up surrounded by faith, by love, by dignity. Thus, Luke Carter was born in June 1981, on a silent night with stars shining over the Texas mountains. Emily raised him with everything she had: milk from the dawn milking, bread baked in the wood-fired oven, and verses read by the dim light of a lamp. The boy grew up strong, serene, full of questions his mother tried to avoid. When he asked about his father, she simply said, "He left before he could meet you." But God never did, and he accepted this as absolute truth. Little by little, Luke became known around town as the fatherless boy, but with a heart too kind to care. The neighborhood respected Emily. Even without saying it, everyone saw her strength, but the whispers still lingered. She was left at the altar. The child is a Whitmore bastard. Emily listened and kept praying. Time, she believed, would heal even the deepest wounds. But time also held surprises. And the past, even buried, never forgets the way back. Luke Carter grew up under the scorching Texas heat and the gentle firmness of his mother, Emily. He learned to ride a horse before he could even tie his own shoelaces. At 6, he was already helping out in the stable. At 10, he was baking bread, alongside his mother, and reading Psalms aloud every morning as part of his routine. He was the son of a silence that was never broken, but also the heir to a faith that never wavered. Emily, even with her heart scarred, never let the pain turn to poison. She chose to teach her son that human abandonment has no power to nullify. God's love dotted school, Luke kept to himself. He avoided questions about his father with a polite smile. Some classmates mocked him, of course. They called him Faceless Luke, as if a piece of his family tree were missing. But he never reacted angrily. He'd just come home, hug his mother at the gate, and move on. On the hardest nights, when the old radio blared country classics on the AM frequency, Emily would sit with her son on the couch and say, "What we don't understand today, God will reveal tomorrow." When Luke turned 17, he found something that would change everything. It was a sultry summer Saturday, and he'd decided to clean out the attic where Emily stored old things. Amid boxes of clothes and dusty books, he found a wooden trunk locked with a rusty chain. He used an old key left in the dresser drawer, and, upon opening it, found letters, yellowed photos, and a silver ring with the initials J.W. James Whitmore. It was the first time he'd seen that name written. The letters didn't say much. Just broken messages, no sender. But the photo of a smiling young man next to a much younger Emily, dressed in white, said it all. Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This was his origin. This was the shadow he'd always felt now, with a face and a name. She pocketed the ring, went downstairs in silence, and that night, while her mother slept, she wrote a farewell letter. Not of anger, but of searching. You left at dawn, backpack on your back and your heart pounding. You didn't tell anyone. You took with you only the ring, the photo, and the Bible your mother had given you when you were still a child. The old Ford pickup truck you'd inherited from a neighbor sputtered at every turn, but it took you to the town of Sage Valley, where, according to one of the letters, James Whitmore was last seen. Luke didn't want a confrontation. He wanted only one thing, an answer. Emily woke to the radio playing Johnny Cash and felt the immediate emptiness in the house. She read her son's letter and didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes, held her rosary tightly in her hands, and prayed, "Lord, wherever my son goes, may your angels go before him. And if he finds his father, may he also find forgiveness." She knew this day would come, because open wounds never heal unless someone has the courage to face them. The road to Sage Valley was long and silent. Luke listened to his mother's old tapes, home recordings of hymns she'd sung in her youth. That voice was his anchor. And yet, an anxiety throbbed inside. What would it be like to look into the eyes of the man who'd left him behind before he'd even known him? Was he alive? Did he remember Emily? Did he know who he was? Upon arriving in town, he searched for any trace of the Whitmore surname. Gas stations, registry offices, hospitals, all with digital files that yielded nothing. Until, in an old bar on the edge of town, a gray-haired woman serving coffee looked at Luke and said, "You have his look in your eyes." The same lost look. Then she whispered, "James Whitmore isn't dead. He just hid from everything." This was the beginning of something much bigger. Luke didn't know it, but he was about to open doors that many had tried to keep closed for decades, and find not only the man who gave him life, but also the unexpected love that would change his story forever. The dusty diner at the end of Sage Valley's main drag seemed frozen in time. Cracked vinyl chairs, an out-of-order jukebox, and a neon sign that flashed the word "open" intermittently, as if unsure. Luke Carter was leaving with the name and address. That would change his life. The woman behind the counter, Martha revealed that James Whitmore lived in seclusion on a secluded ranch in the hills north, 40 minutes from the city. "You've never set foot downtown again," she said. "But you live ... if that's what living is." Luke drove in silence, the truck shaking on the steep curves of the dirt road. His heart pounded like a drum. Every mile brought him closer, not only to his father's body, but also to the unanswered questions of his soul. Why did he leave? Why did he never find out if his son had been born? And worst of all, why remain silent for nearly 2 decades? As the ranch came into view, surrounded by oak trees and a weather-faded barn, Luke sensed he was about to confront more than one man. I was about to face the mirror of what he could have become. The truck stopped in front of the wooden gate, where the red paint had already surrendered to the sun and dust. Luke got out and walked slowly, feeling the ground creak beneath his boots. On the porch, a tall, gray-haired man with a wooden cane watched without moving. James Whitmore stood. They're older, more stooped, but still with a steady gaze, like someone who'd learned to defend himself, even from the wind. The two stared at each other for a long minute, until Luke broke the silence. "My name is Luke Carter, and I came here for one thing, the truth." James said nothing. He just nodded slightly and turned, as if inviting without saying anything. Luke entered. The room smelled of dust, whiskey, and loneliness. The walls displayed old rodeo awards, black and white photographs of happier times, and in the corner, covered by a sheet, what appeared to be a piano. James poured coffee without asking, and finally spoke. "I figured this day would come. Didn't think I'd live long enough to see it." His voice was hoarse, as if each word carried years of undigested weight. They sat facing each other. James stared at his hands, Luke at his face, until the old man said, "I left because I was told you'd both die if I didn't." And so, the story began to unfold. James recounted that the week of the wedding, he received threats from the Roches, a powerful family that did business with the Whitmores. They said Emily would be silenced if the marriage went ahead. He considered running away with her, but was afraid. He chose to disappear. He hid, and he carried the weight of cowardice like a cross. Luke wanted to scream, wanted to pound the table, but he didn't. "You could have come back," he said. "I grew up thinking you didn't want me." James then pulled an old shoebox from a drawer. Inside were dozens of unsent letters, some torn, some crumpled, all addressed to Emily Carter. And there, in the shaky words and painful outpourings, Luke saw a broken man trying to write to the woman he lost, and the son he never knew. It was at that moment that a female voice emerged from the kitchen. "Dad, everything okay?" Luke turned. Before him stood a young woman with green eyes and light brown hair tied back in a ponytail. She wore worn jeans and a plaid shirt, beautiful, with a kind but cautious gaze. "Luke, this is Sarah, your sister." The world spun. Luke stood up slowly, trying to process. James said, "She's from a marriage that came after. Nothing was ever real after your mother." Sarah looked at Luke curiously, like someone looking at part of a book that has always been censored. Luke tried to smile, but the tension was too strong. "I just needed to see you once, to hear it from your mouth. That's all." And he stood up. He was ready to leave. But as he walked through the door, James grabbed his arm and said, his eyes filling with tears, "You may not want a father, but I've wanted a son every day since I left." Luke walked away without looking back. He drove to a nearby clearing and stopped the truck. He sat on the hood and cried like he'd never cried before. It wasn't hate. It was grief that had finally found form, and through his tears, he felt a presence. Sarah had followed in her own truck and was now approaching silently, 2 coffees in hand. She sat beside him. They sat in silence, staring into the distance, until she said, "I don't know what he did to you, but I know he never smiled like that until today." Luke looked at her, and there something new began. A bond, a chance, not to erase the past, but to redefine the future. The sky over the Sage Valley hills was clear that morning, but inside, Luke Carter was laden with clouds too dense to be dispelled by sunshine. He spent the night in an old roadside motel, the same one where truckers stopped to rest between deliveries. The radio played slow country music, and his coffee cup cooled on the coffee table as he reread the letters James had never had the courage to send. Each word felt like a plea for forgiveness buried alive. But forgiveness isn't asked for, it's earned. And Luke still didn't know if his heart was ready for it. The next morning, Sarah Whitmore appeared in the motel parking lot, makeup-free, wearing mud-stained boots and her hair tied back in the same ponytail as the night before. She held an envelope in her hand, and before he could say anything, she handed it to him. "You need to see this. I think he wanted to give it to you himself, but he doesn't know how." Luke opened the envelope and found an old photo. Emily smiling, pregnant, holding hands with James, still young, still whole. Behind the image, a single handwritten sentence. "If I had one more chance ... I'd never walk away again." That hit Luke hard. He didn't respond. He just walked to the truck and stood there, hands braced on the hood, trying to catch his breath. Sarah approached slowly. "Look, I know I'm just a consequence of all that mess, but I don't think you came here just for answers, Luke. I think you came here to start something new." He looked at her, surprised by her frankness. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel anger, just a different silence, the kind that precedes something good. Over the next few days, Luke decided to stay a little longer, not for James, but for Sarah. She took him to see the horses she cared for, the barn where she raised orphaned calves, and the field where she used to lie down at night to watch the stars. Little by little, between simple conversations, they laughed, and in the pauses they stared at each other for seconds too long. Luke knew something was brewing there, but he also knew that love and trauma don't coexist peacefully. They duel until one surrenders. James watched from afar. Sometimes from the porch, sometimes from the barn, but he never interrupted. He knew the time he'd lost with his son was irretrievable, but maybe I could leave something good behind before I left. And it was one Sunday afternoon, as Luke and Sarah sat laughing in the back of the truck, that James approached with an old tape recorder in his hand. "I recorded this the day I left your mother. Never had the guts to listen to it again. Maybe it's time you hear what I couldn't say back then." Luke pressed play. Young James's voice came out scratchy from the tape, shaky, sincere. "Emily, if I'm doing this, it's because I believe I'm saving you, not because I stopped loving you. I'll never stop. I'll never stop thinking about the boy growing inside you, my son." Luke turned off the recorder and remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. When he looked up, Sarah was there not as a sister, but as a woman, as someone who understood what it was like to carry the weight of an emotional legacy. That night, while the town slept, Luke and Sarah sat by the lake behind the ranch. Starry sky reflected on the still water, and the wind blew gently through the pines. Sarah moved closer. "You don't have to stay if it hurts, but if you want to, I'm here." Luke gently cupped her face. Her eyes shone with hope. "I came looking for a man, but I think God led me to find you." The kiss happened right there, under the starlight, with the distant sound of crickets and a pounding heart. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a surrender, a promise, a miracle quietly forming between two souls who who inherited ruins, but decided to plant flowers. The next day, while Sarah was making coffee on the porch, Luke received a phone call that would change everything. His mother, Emily Carter, had disappeared without a trace. The only clue? A letter left on the doorstep, with letters cut from a magazine. If you keep digging, should be buried next. The past wasn't over, and the next step would be life or death. The note was real. The threat left no room for doubt. Luke held the piece of paper trembling between his fingers, the call to the local sheriff still echoing in his mind. Emily Carter, his mother, had disappeared. No sign of a break-in. No witnesses. Just the front door ajar, and the old radio playing a track she loved, "I'll Fly Away." The only visible clue was that letter with cut-out letters, glued together with old glue, like an old movie threats. If you keep digging, should be buried next. Sarah saw panic fill Luke's eyes. He didn't speak, just ran to the truck, started. The engine with the headlights still off, and sped down the road. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat without being asked. She knew she was part of this now. She was no longer just the sister of a rejected half-brother. She was the woman who loved a broken man and who wouldn't let him face this hell alone. The Willow Creek Police Station was on alert. Sheriff Tom Reynolds, an experienced man who had known Emily since her youth, responded personally. "That woman raised you right, Luke. We'll find her." But Luke didn't want words. He wanted action. And then he remembered something Zika, the ranch's former cowboy, had mentioned years ago. An old, abandoned hunting lodge in the hills between Willow Creek and Sage Valley, where James had hidden for a time while fleeing the Roches. It was a forgotten place, with no easy roads, perfect for hiding someone or something. With the help of the sheriff and 2 town volunteers, they formed a group and set out in the early evening, flashlights, radios, and hearts pounding in the darkness. As they reached the hills, the moonlight revealed fresh footprints on the trail, tire tracks, and finally a scrap of fabric with the same floral pattern Emily used to wear for her Sunday dresses. Sarah, upon seeing it, broke down. Luke held on tight, muttering softly, "She's alive." "I know she is." The search intensified until they found the shelter. A wooden shack, covered in vines and moss, with boarded-up windows and a screaming silence inside. The sheriff approached slowly, signaled for silence, and as he tried to break down the door, a shot rang out from inside. Everyone ducked, there, hearts in their throats. A hoarse voice shouted, "Back off, or she dies." Luke recognized the accent immediately. One of the Roches was still around, and there was his mother, Dot. It was then that he made a decision no one expected. He threw the flashlight away, raised his hands, and walked to the door. "Take me instead. Let her go. You have a problem with me, not her." Silence. After several long seconds, the latch creaked. The door slowly opened, and there he was, Travis Roca, cousin of the former family patriarch. Unshaven, bloodshot eyes, gun in one hand, the other holding Emily with a loose rope. "You think your daddy was a hero? He ruined our family. Now you're digging up old bones and think there won't be a price?" Luke approached calmly, his eyes fixed on his mother's. "There's always a price for truth, and I'm ready to pay. But she's not yours to hurt." In a split second of hesitation, Travis moved his gun, and that was all it took. The sheriff acted quickly. A well-aimed shot disarmed the criminal. Travis fell to the ground, groaning. Emily ran into her, son's arms trembling but alive. Sarah knelt beside them, weeping silently. The miracle had happened. God didn't just protect. He gave back. Back in town, while Emily was being treated at the hospital, Luke knelt in the old chapel where he grew up, alone with his hands on his. face and his breath shallow. He whispered, "Thank you for not letting me become like them, for not letting my heart harden." It was there, on that cold floor, that he understood. He had completed a cycle. What his father couldn't finish, he had, but there was still one last step left. The next morning, with Emily by his side and Sarah holding his hand, Luke sought out James. The elderly father, with a weary look, greeted his son with tears in his eyes. Luke said nothing. He simply handed him Daniel's diary, now digitized, attached to the lawsuit against the Roches, and said, "It's done. She's safe. They're finished. And I'm finally free." James couldn't hold back his tears. And in that forgiving silence, Sarah leaned in and said, "Now that the past is buried, can we start planting the future?" But time still had one last gift in store, an unexpected miracle. The following days seemed to bring a breath of peace that had been elusive in Luke Carter's life for a long time. Emily was slowly recovering. The case against the Roches was in the hands of the justice system, and the town of Willow Creek celebrated as if they had all won an invisible war together. In the town square, during the annual fall festival, residents gathered to eat pumpkin pie, play guitar, and watch the sunset dye the fields gold. But in Luke's heart, the war wasn't over yet. He knew that every story of redemption must be complete. And at the center of that story was Love. It was on the porch of the old Carter house, with the strong light swaying in the wind and the smell of cornbread baking in the oven, that Luke finally turned to Sarah. She was sitting in the rocking chair, dressed in a simple blouse and with a look that said more than any words. "I've been thinking, Alkamaku, Kamavazruka. We've been through more in weeks than most couples in years. And if after Tudo Izo you still want me." She stood up slowly, walked over to him, and placed her hands on his chest. "Luke, I didn't fall in love with the man who survived all of this. I fell in love with the man who, even though broken, chose to love. That night, under the stars, he got down on one knee. No ring, no rehearsal, no audience. Just the sound of crickets and her pounding heart. Marry me, Sarah. Let's break this cycle. Let's build a story our kids will be proud to hear." She didn't respond with words. She just knelt beside him and kissed him, tears in her eyes. And that kiss was the miracle they both didn't know they were waiting for. But fate, capricious as always, would not allow the ending to be so simple. 3 days later, while organizing the wedding invitations and cleaning the barn for the ceremony, a black pickup truck pulled up in the distance. From inside, an unfamiliar woman, elegant, wearing sunglasses and a dress far too expensive for the rural setting, got out. She walked firmly up to Emily, handed her an envelope, and said, "I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm just here to claim what's mine." The envelope contained documents, bank records, inheritance papers, and at the top, a name. Evelyn Monroe Whitmore. Sarah held the envelope with trembling hands. The woman's name sounded familiar, and it soon became clear why. Evelyn was James Whitmore's legal wife in another state, married to him before his secret union with Emily. She had discovered Luke's existence, Daniel's will, and now demanded a share of the inheritance. What's more, she claimed Sarah wasn't James's legitimate daughter, but the product of an affair with a ranch hand. The bomb exploded like emotional dynamite. Luke and Sarah looked at each other in shock. The world seemed to collapse beneath their feet. Emily, exhausted from the pain, tried to intervene, but Evelyn left without another word. She left doubt, shame, and fear in the air. Late that afternoon, Sarah disappeared. Luke searched the entire city for her. He only found her sitting by the lake where they had first kissed. Her face was wet with tears. If what she said is true, then who am I, Luke? I'm not a Whitmore. I'm just a mistake. Luke knelt before her, took her hands firmly and said, "Your name doesn't matter. Your blood doesn't matter. You are not the mistake. You are the miracle. And nothing, not even a lie como esa, vai me fazer desistir de nós." She hugged him tightly, as if to blot out the world around them. And there they decided, no matter what came their way, they would choose each other, always. That night, Sarah knocked on James's door. The now frail old man greeted her with teary eyes. "Is it true?" she asked. James wept. He told the truth. Evelyn had gotten pregnant and lied about Sarah's paternity, forcing him to accept her to maintain the family name. But over the years, he loved Sarah as his own daughter, perhaps even more than the daughter he never had. "You were my redemption. You are my legacy." Sarah forgave. And there, another wound was touched by faith. But the twists and turns weren't over yet. Evelyn would return with another coup, a secret buried for decades, and this time, Luke and Sarah's marriage would be put to the test in front of the entire town. The atmosphere in Willow Creek seemed suspended in midair, as if even the wind held its breath, waiting for what was to come. Luke and Sarah's wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday in a flower-filled field behind the old Carter farm, where wild ipe trees sprouted among the dry grass. The whole town was mobilized. The church ladies baked pies, the pastor practiced verses for the sermon, and Emily, now recovered, hand-sewed details on her future daughter-in-law's wedding dress. But behind the smiles, tension lingered, and one name still haunted the scenes: Evelyn Monroe Whitmore. On Wednesday, the house phone rang. Sarah answered and turned pale. Evelyn wanted to meet her, alone. She had arranged to meet at the abandoned Sky Hill lookout, a place where young people went to gaze at the stars. And where, according to ancient rumors, Evelyn's father had been buried after a land dispute. It was a place steeped in the past and in secrets. Luke objected. "She's not coming to make peace, Sarah. She's coming to make a scene." But Sarah looked at him firmly, then let her. "I won't walk into our wedding with Meadow Nas Costas." On the night of the meeting, Sarah climbed Sky Hill alone, her dress fluttering in the dry wind and her courage firm in her heart. Evelyn was waiting for her with a wide hat, a black coat, and a wooden box on her lap. She said bluntly, "Inside this box is Luke's original birth certificate, issued under a different name, and letters that prove James planned to return to." Not his mother. Sarah remained silent. Evelyn approached, her eyes burning with resentment. "Marry him, and these letters will go to the press. I will destroy everything: his father's memory, his mother's name, his reputation." Sarah, in a low voice, simply replied, "Then do it. Because if your power comes from old papers and lies, our love comes from everything God has already healed in us." And she turned away. Evelyn stood frozen, the box clutched to her chest, her anger fading into helplessness. On the way down the hill, Sarah called Luke and said, "She tried, and she failed." On the morning of the wedding, the sky was clear, the sun was mild, and the field was decorated with simplicity and beauty. The altar was made of rustic wood, with flowers from Emily's own garden. The whole town was there. Children ran, elderly people smiled, all thrilled to witness not only a union, but a victory. James Whitmore, sitting in the front row, wore an old suit, a handkerchief in his pocket, and his eyes were teary. Beside him, Emily clutched his hand. They hadn't gotten back together, but they had completely forgiven each other. Sarah walked down the hay aisle to the sound of a guitar played by a family friend. Luke was waiting for her, his heart pounding in his throat. And when she reached his side, he took her hand and whispered, "You are the new beginning that I asked for in silence, and that God gave me out loud." But the moment the pastor opened, the Bible to begin the ceremony. Evelyn appeared. She got out of the car with the box in her hands. The audience turned. Murmurs echoed. Sarah and Luke looked at each other. But before she could say anything, the pastor, in a firm voice, said, "If anyone has something to say, let him speak now or forever hold his peace." Evelyn took a step forward and then stopped. Everyone waited. But she simply dropped the box to the floor, the letters scattered among the leaves and dust. Evelyn looked at Luke, then at Sarah, and with unexpected tears in her eyes, she said, "I thought revenge would bring me peace, but all I ever wanted was to be seen. And you too. You shine too forte priu apagar." And he left. The ceremony continued. And when the pastor declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Luke pulled Sarah into a kiss filled with everything they'd endured. The entire field applauded. And at that moment, a light rain began to fall, washing the earth as if heaven were blessing this new phase. Later, at the reception, James took the microphone. His voice was faint but clear. "I failed. I ran. But today, my son stood firm and proved that love is stronger than any name, any blood, any mistake." And everyone stood up, moved in applause. But as the party progressed, Sarah found a letter. Left on the altar, it wasn't from Evelyn. It was from someone no one expected. Luke's long-lost half-brother. "We've never met, but I've been watching, and now I'm ready to come home." The letter was handwritten, with firm lines and evident maturity. The yellowed paper revealed it had been written some time ago, but only now had it reached the right hands. Sarah read it in silence as the wedding party moved on in the background. Strung lights dancing in the wind and smiles warming the field. The letter read, "Dear Luke, we've never met, but I've always sab que voce existia. My name is Caleb Monroe. I was raised longitudo isso, entre promessas quebradas y nomes trocados. James Whitmore was my father too, but I didn't get a photo, a letter, or even a memory dot. Just silence dot now that I've seen what you construe 'em. I want to know where I belong. Caleb." Sarah looked at Luke, the paper still in her hands. He read every word with teary eyes, as if his soul recognized the name even before he understood it. He was erased, Sarah, like a page ripped from a book. She hugged him from behind, resting her head on his shoulder. Then it's time to rewrite this story together. In the following days, Luke began a silent search for Caleb. He called lawyers, accessed old records, and returned to the forgotten files left by James. He discovered that Caleb had been born in Houston, the result of a brief relationship between James and a young nurse named Elise Monroe. Even before Emily, the baby had been given to his maternal grandparents, and after their death, Caleb had been adopted by a family in Colorado, using the Monroe surname. The entire affair had been covered up by the Roca family. The wound opened once more. James was too weak to travel, but upon learning of his lost son's existence, he cried for the first time in front of Luke. "I asked God for a second chance, and now he's giving me a third. I don't deserve it, but maybe you do." Luke knew what he had to do. He packed his truck, packed only the essentials, and set off with Sarah at his side, crossing states to a town called Durango, Colorado, where, according to the latest clue, Caleb worked as a mechanic at a roadside gas station. Their reunion wasn't like the movies. There were no immediate hugs, no theatrical tears. When Luke got out of the car, Caleb watched him from behind a car raised on jack stands. He wiped his hands on his shirt and approached slowly. "Carter born?" Luke nodded. "Monroe," Caleb responded. "Looks like we got half the truth each." The two sat on the hood of the truck under the sunset. They talked for hours. Caleb didn't want money, nor an inheritance. He just wanted to know if any piece of himself had survived in the story they tried to hide. Luke told him everything about Emily, about Sarah, about the ceremony, about James, and about the moment everything changed. Caleb listened silently, like someone whose name had finally been read aloud after a lifetime of omission. That night, in a simple hotel, Sarah said, "We bring him home, don't we?" And Luke answered, "We bring him home." Back in Willow Creek, the announcement that Caleb was coming shook the town. Some reacted with curiosity, others with trepidation. But Emily, with her calm demeanor, prepared the guest room with flowers on the windowsill and sun-washed sheets. "He is a child of pain, but he is also a child of a miracle," she said. On the day of his arrival, Caleb got out of the truck with his backpack on his back and a look of mixed fear and hope. James, now confined to bed, asked to see him alone. When Caleb entered the room, the old man smiled. "You have your mother's eyes and my guilt," Caleb approached. "Then let's put that guilt to rest, sir," and held her hand. The scene was simple. No fuss, but in that touch. An entire generation was healed. But fate still held one final test in store. A truth buried in Evelyn's documents, who, upon learning of Caleb's arrival, decided to expose what everyone had ignored until then. James Whitmore had a secret will, and it named someone else as the true heir of everything. The letter was handwritten, with firm lines and evident maturity. The yellowed paper revealed it had been written some time ago, but only now had it reached the right hands. Sarah read it in silence as the wedding party moved on in the background, strung lights dancing in the wind and smiles warming the field. The letter read, "Dear Luke, we've never met, but I've always saub que voce existia. My name is Caleb Monroe. I was raised longitudo isso, entre promessas quebradas y nomes trocados. James Whitmore was my father too. But I didn't get a photo, a letter, or even a memory. Just silence. Now that I've seen what you construe 'em, I want to know where I belong. Caleb." Sarah looked at Luke, the paper still in her hands. He read every word with teary eyes, as if his soul recognized the name even before he understood it. He was erased, Sarah, like a page ripped from a book. She hugged him from behind, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then it's time to rewrite this story, together." In the following days, Luke began a silent search for Caleb. He called lawyers, accessed old records, and returned to the forgotten files left by James. He discovered that Caleb had been born in Houston, the result of a brief relationship between James and a young nurse named Elise Monroe, even before Emily. The baby had been given to his maternal grandparents, and after their death, Caleb had been adopted by a family in Colorado, using the Monroe surname. The entire affair had been covered up by the Roca family. The wound opened once more. James was too weak to travel, but upon learning of his lost son's existence, he cried for the first time in front of Luke. "I asked God for a second chance, and now he's giving me a third. I don't deserve it, but maybe you do." Luke knew what he had to do. He packed his truck, packed only the essentials, and set off with Sarah at his side, crossing states to a town called Durango, Colorado, where, according to the latest clue, Caleb worked as a mechanic at a roadside gas station. Their reunion wasn't like the movies. There were no immediate hugs, no theatrical tears. When Luke got out of the car, Caleb watched him from behind a car raised on jack stands. He wiped his hands on his shirt and approached slowly. "Carter born?" Luke nodded. "Monroe," Caleb responded. "Looks like we got half the truth each." The two sat on the hood of the truck under the sunset. They talked for hours. Caleb didn't want money, nor an inheritance. He just wanted to know if any piece of himself had survived in the story they tried to hide. Luke told him everything. About Emily, about Sarah, about the ceremony, about James, and about the moment everything changed. Caleb listened silently, like someone whose name had finally been read aloud after a lifetime of omission. That night, in a simple hotel, Sarah said, "We bring him home, don't we?" And Luke answered, "We bring him home." Back in Willow Creek, this announcement that Caleb was coming shook the town. Some reacted with curiosity, others with trepidation. But Emily, with her calm demeanor, prepared the guest room with flowers on the windowsill and sun-washed sheets. "He is a child of pain, but he is also a child of a miracle," she said. On the day of his arrival, Caleb got out of the truck with his backpack on his back and a look of mixed fear and hope. James, now confined to bed, asked to see him alone. When Caleb entered the room, the old man smiled. "You have your mother's eyes, and my guilt," Caleb approached. "Then let's put that guilt to rest, sir," and held her hand. The scene was simple. No fuss, but in that touch, an entire generation was healed. But fate still held one final test in store. A truth buried in Evelyn's documents, who upon learning of Caleb's arrival, decided to expose what everyone had ignored until then. James Whitmore had a secret will, and it named someone else as the true heir of everything. Life resumed in Willow Creek with the serenity of a river that, after battling rapids, finally finds a calm bed. The dust had settled. The wounds had healed. The countryside flourished, as if the earth had realized it could now breathe in peace. Emily Carter, with her straw hat and steady hands, walked between the rows of lavender Sarah had planted as a symbol of new beginnings. There was something sacred in that scent, something that said, "What was bitter has been sweetened by God." Caleb. Monroe settled into town, not as the new landowner, but as a tireless volunteer at the community center he had helped found. At his side was a battered Bible he had inherited from Emily, and the promise that he would use his part of history to heal and never hurt again. The town, once suspicious, now welcomed him with respect. He was no longer the hidden bastard son he was the brother fate had hidden for too long. Sarah and Luke, now married and stronger than ever, transformed the family ranch into a refuge for orphan children and abandoned women. The once silent house now echoed with laughter, hurried footsteps, and voices of prayer in the evenings. It was there, on the front porch, that Luke would sit each evening with a cup of coffee and gaze up at the sky, thinking of his father not with anger, but with gratitude. He was wrong, but my mother's faith saved our name. James Whitmore was buried under an ancient tree behind the chapel, next to a wooden bench where Emily sat to read the Psalms. The headstone bore no title or long surname, only James, the man who learned to love in the end. At the service a year after his death, Sarah read an excerpt from James's diary that no one else knew about. "If heaven allows me to see my children from there, I want to see them laughing. I want to see them better than I was. And if that happens, I will know that God forgives even the weakest men." The audience rose to its feet in tears. Among them were young men who had lost their parents, women who saw themselves in Emily, men who learned to be more than the world told them they should be. And then something happened. That same night, as everyone was leaving the chapel, Emily heard a knock on the front door. It was a young woman of about 19, with curly hair, brown eyes, and skin marked by the sun and the road. "Sorry to come in like this. My name is Lily Dot. My mother said I needed to come here before making any decisions." Her name was Elise Monroe. Emily invited her in. Luke and Sarah followed soon after. The girl looked around, as if she recognized someone without ever having seen them. "She always told me that I was a piece of something that didn't end, and that maybe this was the place where my story could also begin again." Emily held her hand, smiled, and said, "My daughter, this has always been a place for new beginnings." And so, as if fate still had one last page to write, Lily joined that rebuilt family. Not as another scandal, but as the ultimate living proof that miracles aren't events, they're people. On the porch that night, under the clear Texas sky, with the distant sound of crickets and wind through the trees, Luke said softly, "We didn't just survive, Sarah. We became the answer to the prayer they never had the courage to make." And Sarah replied, leaning on his shoulder, "That's what faith does. It writes final chapters better than we jamais imaginariamos." And if this story touched your heart in any way, if at any point you saw yourself in Emily, Caleb, Luke, or Sarah, then you're already part of this family too. Because this isn't just a farm story, nor just about one man's past. It's about second chances, about faith that spans generations, and about the power of love that heals even the wounds that seemed incurable. Here at Willow Creek, we learned that God writes straight, even with crooked lines, and that when all seems lost, He can still surprise with a miracle that changes the course of everything. If you believe that all pain has a purpose, and that even God's silence is preparation for something greater, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel now. This is where you'll find moving, inspiring stories that always bring a little faith into your home. Turn on the bell, because every week there's a new story like this, written with soul, emotion, and a hint of hope. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Which part touched your heart the most? Your comment could be the miracle someone else needs to read today. See you in the next chapter, and may God bless your path, always.